Good Friday. A day we know we should mark, a day that defines so much of how we follow Christ. Yet a day full of conversations we would much rather avoid. Death, Barabbas. I believe the three of them are entwined as we journey through the events of that Friday. Death. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you cry at puppy videos on Facebook or if you're hard as nails. Death has a funny way of bringing the strongest among us to our knees. Death levels the playing field. There is something hauntingly beautiful about seeing a strong person cry. Beautiful because it reminds us that there is no strength that can stand up to the power of death. Barabbas. Barabbas was bad. He was a criminal, and he would in all likelihood die for the crimes he had committed. Death would have its way until Jesus was brought to the floor. Jesus, sinless, not guilty of any of the shambolic, fictional crimes brought before him. And yet death was lingering in the air. Barabbas or Jesus would feel its cruel sting, one deserving of death, the other didn't even deserve to be dragged before Pilate. But each of these three elements were now inseparably entwined together. Death would have its way. And there was no way out for Barabbas until Jesus was brought forward. There was no future for Barabbas without Jesus. But there was no getting away from the need for someone to die. Someone would need to pay the price for the crime Barabbas had committed. Death would claim its victory today. Barabbas could not avoid its sting. He stood guilty before Pilate, before the crowd, before Jesus. And yet, come Saturday, Barabbas wouldn't simply avoid death's sting. He would find a freedom that was not due. Barabbas is me. Barabbas is you. Stood with our guilt and our shame, deserving of death, and death would have its way. And then Jesus. Then Jesus, who didn't raise his fists. Jesus, who didn't call down the heavenly hosts. Jesus, who didn't simply vanish. Jesus, who didn't perform wonders to turn the crowds in his favor. And then Jesus stood there as Barabbas walked free. You see, even in his last moments, Jesus was bringing freedom to the captive. Death was in the air, and now there stood before the crowd was only one. Jesus was condemned. But don't be fooled into thinking it was ever really just about Jesus or Barabbas that day. It was about Jesus or me, Jesus or you. This was the moment Jesus stood in our place, and before him was Barabbas's death, and my death, and your death. Barabbas never walked free without Jesus. Not simply free from the holds of death, but free from the chains that had bound him. As Barabbas walked free, death lingered in the air. And now the name on its lips was Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews. Jesus would eventually be placed in a borrowed tomb, but I believe he also hung on a borrowed cross, a cross meant for Barabbas. A death required for the sins of all of us. But yet it was neither Barabbas or us who hung there. Instead, it was Jesus, the Son of God, Emmanuel, Prince of Peace, word at the beginning. The injustice of the moment stirs a rage within us. The injustice drives us to clenched fists until we remember Barabbas did not hang Jesus on the cross. Pilate was not responsible. The Roman soldiers, the Pharisee, the crowds, none of them held Jesus there. Love. Love for Barabbas, love for Pilate, love for the soldiers, love for the religious folk and for the lost sheep. Love for you held him on a borrowed cross. And as he breathed his last, and as the curtain tore, and as death finally claimed its victory, Jesus was gone. Gone with the greatest, wildest gesture of love the world would ever know. Death has a funny way of bringing the strongest among us to our knees. Death levels the playing field. You see, there is something hauntingly beautiful about seeing strong people cry. Beautiful because it reminds us there is no strength that can stand up to the power of death. Or so it seemed on that Friday.